I really dislike online presentations now, but unfortunately, I had to have a root canal, a tooth problem when I was in Spain. I got great care in Spain, but still had pain, so I had to come home. And so I really appreciate your tolerance at the end of what has no doubt been a fantastic, dynamic couple of days. And, you know, I'm just so regretful that I didn't get to enjoy those 3 days with you in the mountains. So I'm going to present some new work that has to do with representations of the trans body using architecture and what is called an architecture as a kind of idiom for thinking about gender as it gets made and unmade in the media systems that we currently inhabit. And when I was looking through the program, I can see that there were quite a few presentations on the representation of both the gendered body and the transgendered body. And so I'm sure that there have already been vigorous debates about how we enter into representation, how transness becomes visible, legible, credible, legitimized, and so on through the various media regimes that are available to us. Now, you know, when all we're asking for is visibility, you know, which was a sort of early phase of gender and transgender representation, was to say we want to see trans bodies in media, then you end up with a very limited political range of outcomes from that mode of representation. You can see trans bodies in contemporary film and on contemporary TV, but the way in which the trans body enters into representation does not change the regime of representation itself. Okay, and that is a problem, because then we just simply add ourselves to the range of credible and legible forms of embodiment, but we don't change the system within which trans embodiment was cast as a place of deviance. Okay, so for that reason, at the end of my little book, Trans Asterix, and then in the years since it was published, I've turned to architecture to try to find a better idiom for thinking about the representation of gender. Why architecture? Well, the way that I came to architecture was actually through the work of an artist called Gordon Matta-Clark. And I'll tell you a little bit about him. There was, when I first moved to New York in 2016, there was a big retrospective of his work up in the Bronx. And Matta-Clark was an architect from the 1970s. He lived in New York City. He went to Cornell, received an architecture degree, came back to the city at a time of urban crisis and unrest, the 1970s. The city was bankrupt. The urban landscape looked like a post-war landscape. It was bombed out and falling down, and so on. And into that landscape, Gordon Matta-Clark came as an artist and began not to fix things or repair things, but to unbuild. And that was his method, if you like. And he called himself an architect, joining this notion of undoing to the figure of the architect, and at the same time joining an understanding of the architect in relationship to anarchy. All right, let me start sharing my screen so that I can give you some images for people who don't really know Matta-Clark's work and know why this work would make an interesting idiom through which to represent gender. It will become a bit clearer when I show you some of that work. So here, let me get this slideshow going a bit better. There you go. Okay, so I'm pulling from architecture and architecture, both a way of thinking about the body metaphorically, right? What if we think of the body as a building? And in the past, we've thought in terms of social construction. So there's been this notion of building a body. But what if in the contemporary neoliberal mode that we inhabit, we actually have to start taking things apart, not building, precisely because this system that we're entrenched in does not allow for changes in the structure. It only allows for changes in relationship to the claims that people make about themselves. So let's use this category of unbuilding and see if it takes us anywhere. Here's an image of Gordon Matta Clark. And in this photograph, we can see him unbuilding in Paris at the Paris Biennale in 1975. What was happening in Paris in 1975 is quite similar to what's happening in Paris today, namely massive scale gentrification. In the 1970s, an entire neighborhood was being removed to make way for the Centre Pompidou. And in contemporary Paris, entire neighborhoods are being removed in order to make way for the Olympics. Is everything okay? Can people hear me all right? Maybe somebody in the front. It's good? Okay. All right. Okay, so here in this photograph, we can see Matta Clark making one of his signature and iconic works. This one is called Conical Intersect. So as Paris was taking down entire neighborhoods to make way for the Centre Pompidou, Matta Clark took a 17th century townhouse that was supposed to be demolished, and he built and unbuilt it from the inside out.
Yes,
and he
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there is your color palette is interrupting and distracting your presentation.
What is
your color palette? I'm sorry, the window. There is a window popping up from your computer. Okay,
I can't see it.
Perfect. Okay, leave it that way. Oh, can you see it?
No. What is the window? Oh, a color window. Is that it?
The color palette. Yeah,
let me see if I can get rid of that. Is it that?
Yes. Oh, yes. Perfect.
Okay, so sorry.
All the time, so it was very distracting. Okay.
That's distracting. Is that okay now?
Perfect. Thank you very much. Sorry for that.
This is why we dislike online presentations. Okay. If anything else comes up, just wave wildly from the front row, and I'll attend to the issue. Okay, so you know, there are a couple of different ways in which you can respond to something like gentrification. You can just try to build better houses and redistribute housing opportunities, or like Matta Clark, you can start to unbuild. And that's what he did starting in the 1970s. And in the way of unbuilding, he sort of uncovers and creates a new kind of utopian project. Generally speaking, in queer studies, we have been oriented towards world building. This is a term that Eve Sedgwick used, Jose Munoz used, Michael Warner used. Early queer theory was all about world building. But we're not in the era where we should be thinking in these imperial terms any longer. And so I offer this idiom of anarchitecture in order to propose to you that the best way to use the lessons learned from the exclusions visited upon the trans body is to reorient towards world unbuilding. And this at a time of global real estate, speculative capitalism, environmental disasters. I came back to New York City this week to find it was in the middle of the afternoon, dark with the smoke of wildfires from Canada. We don't need to build worlds. We need to unbuild them. And if we can use the trans body as a source of information, then, you know, about how to unbuild, then this seems to me to be an interesting outcome. How could we use the trans body to do that? Well, if, as I said at the beginning, the trans body simply slots into a system of gender as it already exists, then it simply becomes part of that regime of gender. But if we understand the trans body as a kind of unmaking of the entire order of gender, then we begin to see symbolically and ideologically how systems can come apart. That's what I'm going to propose today, and I'm going to take us through some strategies for doing this, both from the present and from the 1970s. Let me start with one such project. And much of what I'm saying today about unbuilding works hand in hand with what in Europe is being called destitution. Destitution is a kind of philosophical and political orientation to political systems that does not simply want to repair those political systems or make them better or improve them or develop them, but that wants to dismantle them. In this way, it's a kind of anarchist project. Sometimes it's associated disastrously, I think, with the work of Agamben, but more importantly, it's been part of various anonymous collectives, like the Invisible Committee, who in one book argue that we should destitute the world. So in terms of what destitution actually means as a theoretical reference, this is a quote from an essay called 3 Registers of Destitution by Kieran Ahrens and Idris Robinson. And they say, if destitution names a set of insurrectionary movements that seek, in their words, to tear down, dismantle, and cancel prevailing political representations and institutions, then they're saying that they do so without proposing others to replace them. So this is the point of destitution. Not just that you tear things down, but you do orient towards tearing things down, but you do so without proposing something else in its place. Why do you do that? Why wouldn't you want to replace the bad with the good, the old with the new? Because the only kind of futures that we can imagine from our current ideological entrenchment are continuations of the same, because we are embedded in an ideological system within which the solutions are as bad as the problem. So destitution suggests that you have to take something apart without knowing what will be on the other side of that act of dismantling. That's a very anarchitectural mode. And that, in many ways, is what some trans people are doing, taking gender apart without necessarily knowing what gender will look like on the other side. And in this way, thinking about some of the building blocks of the ideological system that we inhabit and beginning to take them apart piece by piece, seam by seam, brick by brick, until what we're left with is a kind of ideological ruin out of which something else can come, but we have to be disciplined enough not to say what that something else is yet. Okay, so if you're like, okay, what would this look like in a trans project? Let me give you an example. Okay, oh, that's another Matter Clark building, just to keep going with showing you how when you begin to take a house apart, you reveal new systems and new structures, new geometries of material and space and air and light. And those new geometries then open onto thinking about different ways of living. Here's a ruin. This ruin is let's say the foundation for a piece by trans artist Eve Laris Cohen. This ruin was created by a fire in 2019 in Massachusetts, a fire in the Doris Duke Theater, which is part of a historic dance theater out in the Berkshires in Massachusetts in the US. And this, was largely seen as a terrible tragedy. This is probably another victim to a kind of wildfire. It could have been arson, but at the point where Eve Laris Cohen began his work with this ruin, the origin of the fire was not known. When Yves Lariscohen heard that the Doris Duke Theatre had burned down, he rushed from his fellowship in the area, he was on fellowship in that same area, to the theatre and pulled entire systems out of the wreckage. Those systems, like old pipes, scaffolding, bits of wall, bricks, and so on, he took with him back to New York and made a new piece with these leftover pieces post-ruination. And these pipes and girders became a kind of unstable foundation, we could say, for a performance that he then enacted in New York City 2 years later. Now, when talking about the fire, Yves Lariscohen explained that the fire was, people kept looking, why did the fire burn this theater down? What happened? How could this be? And in the end, it was ruled undetermined. And I'll get to that in a moment. It was ruled undetermined. And he says about that, the fire's cause was undetermined. And he says his interest in the cause of the fire, his disinterest, sorry, in the cause of the fire comes from, quote, here's the quote, both a trans and a crip sensibility. From my sense, my desire to resist or refuse others' desires to know, whether it be gendered anatomical details or the cause of my chronic illness, which incidentally could also be classified as undetermined. He suffers from Crohn's disease, which is a gastrointestinal disorder that takes a long time to diagnose. So he says, I'm trans and I suffer from a disorder, the origins of which are unknown. This indeterminacy is important to me, and I don't want to resolve it, okay? So this is what the piece looked like. So here are, you can see that for somebody who suffers from a gastrointestinal disorder, this is an interesting piece. It looks almost like bowels or, an internal system that he has pulled out of the theater, reminding us that the theater is not just a building, it's also this internal set of organs and logics. Similarly, the body is not only the visual surface that gets read in all of these interactions that we have socially and visually. There's an internal logic to the body too that we ignore because we're so obsessed with visual surfaces. And when we ignore this internal logic to the body, we're not really dealing with embodiment. We are simply dealing with a kind of representational system that turns everything into the same. Now, the actual performance that he carried out was, and you can't quite see it in this piece, but it was a kind of exhausting experience where he raises and lowers the grid of pipes that he's pulled from the wreckage and reassembled in the space of the studio. He lowers it and raises it, lowers it and raises it until his own body runs out of energy. So there's a kind of connection to this broken material and to the idea of breaking the body. The other thing to know about Yves Lariscohen was that as a young person, he trained as a ballet dancer. And so this theater and all of its logics of representation are very important to him. But he was assigned female at birth. So he was raised as a girl ballet dancer. And when he transitioned from female to male, he lost his ballet training, basically, because ballet is so gendered that it was impossible for him to use what he had already learned to now perform in the body of a man. And so he's thinking here about these systems, these regimes, these disciplines that are imposed on the body, gendered disciplinary forms that are imposed upon the body, both in terms of the everyday scripts that we use to move through the world, but also in these aestheticized scripts like ballet. So his instinct is not simply to train as a male ballet dancer, right? His instinct is to take the whole system apart and put it back together again in some other order, in which we see just a tangle of pipes. We no longer see the theater, and yet the theater is there. Okay, so that's, that gives you a little bit of a sense of what destitution might consist of. Destitution in many ways is a kind of anti-institutional mode of thought, not only because it's proposing to take structures apart rather than build them up, but also because it offers critiques of those systems and their legitimating techniques. And therefore, this is a much bigger project than just saying, oh, why can't somebody born as a girl, trained as a ballet dancer, and then transitioning to become a man, why can't he do ballet? It's him saying, let's take the entire system apart through the force of the critique offered by the trans body. This whole system must be unbuilt and dismantled. And I think this is, an incredibly complex piece of work that is building upon a set of trans techniques that are concerned not with being seen, being known, being recognized, but with obscurity, illegibility, and abstraction. And we're going to return to abstraction at the end of the talk. I'm going to show you a number of other works made by trans people who are refusing the representational mode offered to trans people, which is the figure, and instead are trying to use abstraction in order to pull trans people out of the political gaze that at this particular moment is so ruinous. What do I mean by that? Well, certainly in the US, and no doubt in Spain, definitely in parts of Latin America today, there are wars being fought against trans people, and specifically trans young people, by political conservatives. And one of the fundamental tactics of anti-gender regimes, it turns out, is basically trying to suppress transition, medical transitions, the management, the clinical and medical and hormonal management of the trans body is a target of right-wing attacks right now. So in Florida right now, for example, in the US, not only can you not say gay in the schools, you cannot teach about trans and gays and lesbian peoples, but you also cannot get gender-affirming care any longer. And if a parent intervenes on behalf of their trans child and asks for gender-affirming care, the child can be removed from the parent's home, and the parents can be accused of child abuse. So this is not the moment for visibility, recognition, and so on. We need much more complicated tactics in order to oppose these right-wing Christian so-called family-first tactics, and to bring about another order of being. So in a way, what I'm saying is, on the one hand, the trans body doesn't seek simply to be admitted into a system, but seeks to destroy that system. And on the other hand, when we do simply seek to be absorbed into the system, we become the targets of new attacks. Why are trans people the targets of so many attacks right now? My answer, and this may be different from the answers you could give from the context that you're in, my answer is that so many young people around the world are coming out now as either gay, lesbian, trans, or non-binary, that current estimates suggest that some 40% of young people in some parts of the world are not simply identifying as straight. So we're reaching a critical moment here where there is no longer a clear majoritarian hegemony around heterosexual normative gendered bodies. Conservatives and Republicans and Christians know this because their kids are coming out to them. Their children are coming home and saying, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm trans, I'm non-binary, and in huge, huge numbers. And when they do so, the instinct of these conservatives is to try to cut off the information that flows to these young people in the hopes of staunching this massive wave of contrary identification that is sweeping through younger generations. So in many ways, this is also a war on young people. And that, that war on young people, it seems to me, and I think I have a few slides. Here's some of the slides out of Florida. This war on young people is because young people have massive critiques of older generations. And those critiques are not just about the gender system. Those critiques are of the financial ruin that has been visited upon them, about debt, about having to pay for college, about the ruin of the environment, ruination of the environment, and so on. So, so let's think about this for a moment and turn to the question then of ambiguity. All right. So, even 20 years ago, there was a very clear emphasis in queer studies and in homophobic discourse on hetero versus homo. And people were like, okay, there's a heterosexual majority. Most people are normatively gendered. What are we going to do with these minoritarian populations? As I just said, this is no longer the case. Ambiguity is, in fact, the norm. Some sort of ambivalent relationship to one's body is pretty much, the experience of embodiment for the most part. And I think that we're no longer in that binary system. Therefore, this terminology, at least in English, of non-binary holds a lot of information within it. Non-binary is not simply someone saying, I don't have a gender, or I'm not sure of my gender. Non-binary is a destituting order that says no to the binary system as a whole. And not only to the binary system of gender, but also the binary system perpetrated within capitalism of rich and poor, the binary system within education of the privileged and the excluded, the binary system in the housing market of the homeowner, the renter, the binary contrast between people who own homes all over the world and homeless populations. Non-binary is a massively articulated refusal by young people in relationship to the entire system that is being offered to them by generations who have literally ruined the world. Now, there's lots of debate about non-binary in trans studies itself. And one essay that came out recently created a lot of debate. So this is an essay by a theorist who I would call neoconservative. That's how I would identify Kaji Amin, a neoconservative trans theorist who believes he's saying something radical, but in the end is just kind of missing the point on what non-binary is. So in an article called We Are All Non-Binary, A Brief History of Accidents, a very, very well-written, well-argued argument essay, by the way, he makes this claim. And I'll read it to you because since you haven't read the article necessarily, it will be hard to get the gist of the piece otherwise. Non-binary identity is therefore not, as some non-binary people would have it, a radical refusal of the colonial gender binary. For binary Western thinking has governed every step in the history of Western gender sexual categories, generating an idealized opposite for each new category coined. The core binary that governs non-binary thought, however, is less that between binary and non-binary than that foundational to Western thought between the autological sovereign individual and the unchosen genealogical bonds of the social. I'll come back to that in a moment. It is therefore difficult to imagine an identity more provincially Western and less decolonial than contemporary non-binary identity. And this is meant to be a polemic, okay? He opens the essay saying, you know, suddenly there are people everywhere identifying as non-binary. They don't seem to have much in common. They could easily appear as conventionally gendered, but they call themselves non-binary, or they might be cross-identified, but they call themselves non-binary. And he's like, this is a useless category. It doesn't do anything politically. It is in fact subject to the colonial inscription of Western binaries. And the binary that it is propping up is that between the autological sovereign individual and the unchosen genealogical bonds of the social. Now, honestly, this is just Butlerism, but it's Butlerism without Butler's radical critique. When he says that the non-binary is confusing themselves with an autological sovereign individual, well, that's what Butler said circa 1989 in Gender Trouble. She said, we think that we choose our gender, but we don't. We don't choose our gender. We are chosen by the genealogical bonds of the social. So this is the old dressed up with as the new, but without the radical critique that Butler proposed through the category of performativity. And I really, really object to this argument, even though when my students all started telling me they were non-binary, I maybe shared some of Kaji Amin's frustration with this category. I was like, what is this category? What do you even mean by that? Aren't you in a binary with the binary if you're non-binary? You know, I was unclear about what non-binary meant, but I think that I've understood non-binary differently in recent years by thinking through this sea change that has occurred across gendered bodies, particularly in Euro-American context. And the problem with this particular argument that Amin is making is he's basically projecting onto non-binary people the fiction of the autological sovereign individual. But as Butler said, everybody entertains that fiction. Everyone other than the small percentage of us who read philosophy, find our way to the works of Judith Butler and others, and understand that most of what we call identity is not chosen, cannot be rescripted by us, is not open to massive change on an individual level, and so on. So to blame non-binary people, or to basically accuse them of the very myth of personhood that animates liberal individualism is ridiculous on the one hand. But on the other hand, I think it's a deep misreading of the radical politics that young people are generating through the category of non-binary. So for me, using this notion of ambiguity, then, it makes more sense to read non-binary as a refusal of the systems of classification as they currently exist. It is not a desire to indulge in a kind of fantasy of self-determination. It is, however, part of a strategy designed to destitute the binary order of men and women and all the property relations that depend upon that distinction altogether. So what does non-binary do? Non-binary says no to the binary. It says no to the binary governing debt relations. It says no to the environmental systems that circulate around the family. It says no to the heterosexual or homosexual couple. It says no to marriage. It says no to mandatory reproductive outcomes, and so on. This quote from actually a graduate student at Columbia with whom I work, who's doing a brilliant dissertation on non-binary, seems to speak much better to the politics of non-binary than Kaji Amin does. And so this is a quote from Levi Hord's dissertation, where he writes, quote, "Non-binary demonstrates a resignification away from pre-existing binary determination without repeating its restrictions, doing damage to the assumption that one must be a certain type of subject to refuse a restricting ideology, to hold a resistant politics, or to participate in a coalition." So in other words, non-binary is non-identitarian politics, and it is one that, as he puts it, demonstrates a resignification away from pre-existing binary determination. To me, that is a much better understanding of non-binary, and it places non-binary in a larger context outside of just the molecular negotiations about the gendered body, and within the materialist sets of relations that extend from gendered bodies through the economy and so on. Recently, artist and filmmaker Wu Sang has started to talk about in-betweenness. So I think that non-binary is the beginning, if you like, of new systems of thought that are not at all sure that there are polarities in the world, the binaries that deconstruction took aim at back in the 70s. We're living in a period of in-betweenness that is best described and that is best represented by trans bodies, non-binary bodies, bodies that seek to remain eligible to a liberal system of governance based upon modes of recognition. All right, so thinking about time here a little bit, I'm going to make a quick, I've said a lot already about anarchitecture, so I'll just give you a little bit more of a sense of it and why I'm pitching my tent, if you like, with ambiguity, in-betweenness, and architecture, and looking there for a language and a vocabulary and a semiotic system that is better suited to the kind of destituting politics that we need. And then I'll quickly conclude with just a few more images of abstract works by trans artists that shift away from that representational regime within which you have to show up, you say you're trans, and now you have to fulfill the requirements of the gender to which you have transitioned, right? That's what transition is. You leave one place where there's discomfort, you transition to another, and you obey the scripts and the logics that are embedded in this new gendered position. But what if we don't? Okay, that's the question. And you can hear some of this ideation in the writings of Gordon Matta Clark, who says, what I do to building is what some people do with language and other groups do with people. I organize them in order to explain and defend the need for change. So building for him is like a language, if you like. And so when he takes the building down, he's also unmaking the grammar with which we understand space and living and the organization of bodies in space. When he takes that apart, he's both taking apart a grammar and then laying open the old grammar on behalf of creating the conditions for change. Okay, he doesn't build a new grammar. He takes apart the old, right? That's the destituting order. Take it apart. Don't suggest what comes next. And here's just an example of that destituting logic. This is one of his pieces from, again, New York City, 1970s. An old subway car that is not being used in a system that is falling apart. The whole of New York was built, even though its reputation is as a city where you have public transportation, it is a absolutely crumbling public transportation system because various urban designers in the 50s and 60s in New York City built New York City to meet the measurements of the car and the freeway. And so here's a sort of symbol of that. And what Matt Clark has done here is take an old subway car and use it as a bridge to create a bridge between nowhere and nowhere. So it isn't, these are never solutions. These are never like, oh, we needed to get from A to B, let's make a bridge. It's just a bridge. It's a bridge from one undefined place to another, but it's a repurposing and an unbuilding without repair, creating something else out of the ashes of something that has fallen apart, but without developing, improving, and repairing. As Mata Clark said, responding really to the work of architect Le Corbusier and to urban developers of New York City like Robert Moses, he suggests that an architecture seeks to solve no problem, seeks to solve, this is just an amazing statement, I think, in the sense that Le Corbusier saw architecture as a way to resolve social problems, and very much threw his lot in with the fascists in the 40s, and built exquisite buildings for middle-class people, and never really understood that building better buildings cannot resolve the social problems of any given city. So Mata Clark called attention to the problem of the urban distribution and equal distribution of wealth by unbuilding things and unmaking the urban environment. And this is another one of his statements, nothing works. Now, you might expect nothing works could be a kind of conservative damning of social programs like, oh, nothing's working in this city. But for Mata Clark, nothing was the thing that was working, if you like, okay? Nothing was the thing that was working. And while the fantasy of the 60s and 70s was of the architect as the world builder, the imperial master of the city, building bigger and bigger phallic buildings, the An architect, on the other hand, introduces the split. And for me, this is one of Mata Clark's most iconic works, precisely because it is about taking the building apart without simply bringing it down, right? And if you ask me, well, what is the work here? The work is that sliver of light that you see between the two halves of the building. Nothing works. The nothing that you see through the building. The reminder that a house is nothing. It's only made something by the real estate market and by speculation, okay? So we have to start seeing nothing as a kind of theory that joins with in-betweenness and ambiguity. In-betweenness, ambiguity, unbuilding, nothing. These are going to be the building blocks to get us out. All right. And here's one of those statement pieces, a view on the city from the perspective of the building that is being taken apart. What if we saw the city through this destituting gaze? And this one is a great piece by Mata Clark, precisely because it takes aim at speculative real estate. This piece from 1975 was called False Estates, which obviously in English is a play on the real of real estate. It's a reminder that real estate is not real. The building that you buy does not hold that value in terms of its material makeup. The building that you buy has an unreal value depending upon a market. So in this piece, Mata Clark bought up lots of lots, what were called sort of gutter lots of unusable little tiny plots of land in New York City. And he bought them up so that no one could use them. And his only specification for whether he would buy them or not was whether you could occupy the space in any meaningful way. And if you could not, he bought them. All right. In the words of trans theorist Ava Hayward, the cut for the trans body is possibility. just as a trans surgery opens up the meaning of the body, so says Ava Haywood, the cut is possibility. All right, in the interest of time then, I'm going to skip these slides just to say that in the 70s, there were, and I go into this in the book that I'm trying to finish, strange as this vocabulary may sound to us, the vocabulary of cutting, dismantling, destroying, this kind of violent vocabulary may not sit well in a contemporary era. But that was the vocabulary of feminism in the 1970s, the feminism that was unwinding alongside Gordon Matta Clark in New York City. The feminism of Born in Flames, a black film about post-revolutionary feminist uprisings, where the women form an army, get guns from the Middle East and take aim at the government. Violence was the language of Valerie Solanas' Scum Manifesto, and violence was the language of the brilliant Dutch film from 1979, A Question of Silence, where three women who don't know each other spontaneously erupt into an episode of anti-sexist violence and kill a shopkeeper unprovoked. I'll let you go watch that film to know more about it. But in other words, feminist art making in the 70s was rife with the language of violence. We don't think violence is a good language any longer, but through this new emphasis on destitution, we might want to think again. All right, I'm going to conclude then in the hopes of having some discussion to breach this gap between us that the online conference creates. I want to just kind of conclude by thinking with you about some of this other work that I've been interested in coming out of artists who are interested in abstraction. And remember I said that Eve Laris Cohen's work is super interesting to me because it abstracts the body. The body is understood as a location of systems of consumption and delivery and expulsion, systems that are determined by health and ill health, systems that are embedded in various complexes, industrial complexes, health complexes, family complexes, intimacies, kinships, and so on. Abstraction is able to locate the body in relation to a system. When we just see figures, and these are great pieces of work, don't get me wrong. On the left there, you have a piece by Della Grace Volcano from the 1990s. I think it's, by the way, high time for a retrospective on the work of Della Grace Volcano, who made some of the most arresting images of queer and particularly lesbian and gender variant life in the 1980s and 90s. This one is a gorgeous figure of a genderqueer person set against, again, this kind of destitute urban landscape in the background. And I think what I love about Dell's work is that while the figure is very compelling here, so is the backdrop. Less true for the lower right, that's a Kathy Opie portrait. And Kathy Opie's portraits, even though Opie does in other work train her camera on the landscape, on the ocean, on freeways, on the mid-century city architecture, in the portraits of trans people, we get these very bare bones portraits that have, as she herself says, were influenced by portraiture from the Dutch artists like Hans Holbein and so on. And they are just beautiful images, but without context, without any material world attached to them. Obviously, above that is Claude Cahun's, really enigmatic photography from the 1940s. Until recently, this was the sum of trans representation. figures. Figures sometimes set against a landscape, figures sometimes oriented within a history of portraiture, figures sometimes calling attention to the performativity of the self and the body, but nonetheless, figures, okay? So what happens if we lose the figure and imagine the landscape or the abstract image as a trans image? This is another piece by Del LeGray's Volcano. And I remember saying to Del at one point that while the images of the figures that he takes pictures of are gorgeous, so are the backdrops that he often gives them. And I spent a lot of time when I was working with Del looking at the backdrops he had chosen and thinking about how important the backdrop is. When Del went to Antarctica, maybe about 10 years ago, to do some work with Mojisola Adebayo for a project that Moj was carrying out called Moj of the Arctic, to call attention to the kind of the whiteness of Arctic and Antarctic exploration. Del took a series of extraordinary landscapes. And this one, for example, is titled Otherworldly Antarctic Peninsula, 2005. So it was quite a long time ago, 15 years ago. And here, what I would call trans about the landscape is the utter disorientation of this landscape. Is it upside down? Are we looking at the sun or the moon? Are we looking at the earth or the sky? Are we looking at the water? Are those clouds or ice or foam? We recognize components of the image, but the image as a whole does not give up its meaning. And that's what abstraction can do. And this is similar to what Eve Laris Cohen, remember, said about those, the innards of the theater. He said that they have a kind of indeterminacy that he feels represents the refusal of the trans body to give up its identity, or to be read simply according to the logics of conventional identity. This is another one by Jonah Grunberg, and you can see the title at the top there. I can't actually read it, my screen's cut it off. But this piece was written about recently by art historian David Getze. And he said about this piece, what does it mean for an artist to make works that are hard to see? And these are thread sculptures. And when you get close, you can see that they're actually shapes made out of thread that hangs from the ceiling, and that you can only see if the light hits it a certain way. And I think that this is a beautiful way of suggesting that some trans bodies evade, and refuse easy visual consumption, and instead linger in this in-between space of the visible and the invisible. El Perez does something similar by taking photographs of testosterone conducting light. And she writes in her practice, she says, you can use photography to depict things that you can actually not picture. It has so much to do with identity and how surfaces have the ability to contain the traces of an experience. That's just a lovely way of putting it, using photography to depict things that you cannot actually picture. So I'm arguing that abstraction allows parts of transness to remain unavailable, off limits, unseeable, illegible to the easy consumption of the gaze that wants to just gather up trans experience and repurpose it through neoliberal mechanisms. Okay, my final piece that I want to share with you brings together a few of the themes of this talk, the ruin from Matta Clark and Eve Laris Cohen, but also a kind of abstract sculptural representation of trans embodiment. Ken Williams, and ambiguity. Ken Williams is a Black non-binary artist living in New York City, and this piece is called An Accumulation of Things That Refuse to Be Discarded. It's, as I say here, a hanging sculpture. The bricks are taken from demolished low-income housing, and they represent both an impulse to save and an impulse to refuse, rescue, and repair. And so I suggest that Ken Williams is a non-binary artist representing a figure. This is like a figure where you see the little face at the top, but a figure that is also ground, foundational, but is also in suspension, object, and subject. So in conclusion, then, these examples of trans abstraction, non-human landscapes, tributes to Black survival, point to alternative political projects in which feminism is central. Trans and non-binary people articulate political positions rather than assuming preordained positions, and art leads to less certain, more complex braidings of futurity, pastness, lostness, foundness, figuring ground, materiality and ideology, refusal and rebellion. The abstract work that I've been looking at throughout the talk looks past idealizations and reductions and offers landscapes of snow, ice, water, sites of demolition, life after life, art after representation, and trans after trans. Thank you. Thanks.